Hello there everyone. I wanted to create a little video that doesn't have any elaborate script or storytelling here, but rather chat with you a lot about some discoveries I've made in the recent years I've been creating levels. Knowing how YouTube's algorithm functions with recommending videos, you probably clicked on this video because of the title and thumbnail. Well, I can assure you I am not here to steal your time away from you. This is mainly to be an informative video where I share my personal discoveries. So, for those that regularly play Geometry Dash in the latest update, you will probably know of the 8 main game modes that exist in this game. Cube, Ship, Ball, UFO, Wave, Robot, Spider, and Swingcopter. Not going to talk about platformer mode here because it has nothing to do with what I want to mention really. While these range heavily in versatility of what can be made with them, they all have at least one unique trait that make them stand out on their own. And sadly, I quite regularly call out the community's high-tier levels as being very bland in exploring gameplay. Very often in the modern day, the so-called best levels in the game put all their focus on completely overloading you with overstimulation and realistic decoration, as if to mask the fact that gameplay-wise, there's barely anything happening in comparison. And now in Update 2.2 as well, with the jerky camera movements and epilepsy-inducing screen effects, it also hurts my eyes and makes people who watch me play these things dizzy. I am someone who values gameplay more than decoration, since I am playing a video game, not watching a movie. So I feel consistently underwhelmed playing these levels that are supposed to be quote-unquote the best. As such, I found myself way more interested in my own gameplay in order to satisfy that missing aspect I don't get from the community. For anyone who has watched my channel for a long time, you will know that a long time ago I began a level/video series titled Messing Around, which is still around to this day. The purpose of this series was for me to take any song I felt creating around and present unique gameplay ideas that came from my head when listening to the songs. This series has become crazier and crazier as time progressed, with the craziest entries also being the latest 3. Volnix, the hardest level I've ever created with the dot gimmick where you jump around as a little dot in pixel perfect precision. Juggler, which introduced the grapple hook, which quite literally lets the player drag the entire level to you. And Tempest, which introduced the idea of destruction of the level, plus the idea that sparked the creation of this video. Now, I realize what I'm about to say will have a fair few players roll their eyes and hear me motivate the usage of this, but to me, the best game mode that pretty much no one I know uses is the 2-player mode. Yeah, hang on. I am very aware of what I'm suggesting here and the potential of creating some of the most god-awful gameplay in the entire game, which is especially prone to happen in this community that sacrifices quality over difficulty in a heartbeat. But what I'm saying is that despite the risk of creating even more garbage gameplay arises, it can also do the opposite and elevate the creativity and quality of the gameplay design even more. I'll quickly go through some examples of 2-player mode that managed to hit success of some kind to establish what the community has made with this so far. If we take a look at most of the attempts that were done to create 2-player mode levels, I feel like if there's one element that is not executed well is the fact that the gameplay in 2-player mode parts often don't complement each other. The most extreme case of this would be the demon codependence, which is generally the best example of that I can think of. They essentially slapped 2 different levels together, made gameplay for their sections, and never had the sections truly interact with each other. It's an insanely missed opportunity, and if you ask me, the exact opposite of what you should do with this gameplay gimmick. I am aware that this was supposed to be a level beaten by 2 people at once, but not only are there levels that complement that idea better than codependence, but that gives the middle finger to a ton of people in the community who maybe don't have someone else to play with on something this hard too. I can commend the attempt because it is an original idea, but it is done so terribly and unintuitively that it becomes so uninteresting. Moving on to some more interesting examples, I'll first go back to the early days of the 1.8 update, where the duel feature was first introduced, and I will mention one of my personal favorites from the old era, Dragon Force by Sorakami. There's barely any 2-player mode gameplay in this whatsoever, but the one section that it does have demonstrate a much more interesting approach to what can be done with 2-player mode. The ship and ball duel seen here demonstrate a really nice attempt at 2-player mode gameplay, as both icons go through the same segment and the simplicity of what each icon needs to do complements the part wonderfully. Since there is more the player needs to do to get through this segment, having gameplay that is much more basic for each icon is really nice attention to gameplay fundamentals. You can have them do more of course as evident by codependence, but as I will demonstrate later, There are much cooler and more interesting approaches to doing so. But Dragon Force showcases one element that I enjoy from 2-player mode, which is the simplicity of its gameplay design, despite technically having to do more than usual. To some people that might be confusing to hear, but this idea is good to multiple aspects. For the creator, it is pretty simple to create and bug test parts that come from 2-player mode, since it doesn't have to depend on moving objects or triggers of any kind to function. Of course, that is the case of any game mode in the game, but 2-player mode is probably objectively the most complicated gameplay to learn of any level, since it massively changes how you need to approach a section. For that reason, creating more simple gameplay to combat the complexity that 2-player mode provide helps create a natural extension to the level's gameplay flow while not being overwhelming to learn. Of course, that doesn't mean you have to avoid making something incredibly difficult to play or learn if you wanted to. By all means, do what you want. But if you value player enjoyment, which is probably wishful thinking in this community, but whenever you have a more complex mechanic to work with, it is sometimes better to introduce it with an easy part if you want a casual player to have a reasonable go at it. Dragon Force is a good example of what happens when you do consider this, and codependence is what happens when you don't. And I know, some people might point out that it isn't fair to use codependence as an example, since it was deliberately designed to be played by two separate players, and yeah, I know, you're right. But considering what the third level I wanted to bring up does, it really just drags that level down in the mud even more, since it once again shows how underutilized the concept was. As such, last but not least, I would like to bring up another level, which is probably what majority of players in the game would think about today when talking about the 2-player mode levels, which is Duelo Maestro by Nacho21. I do believe that so far, this is probably the best example of a good 2-player mode level that we have, since it does do pretty much the opposite of what codependence does. There are entire sections devoted to 2-player mode gameplay, and these integrate with each other wonderfully, presenting incredibly unique segments. Multiple game modes are mixed and mashed together to create distinct parts that stand out on their own really nicely. But despite that, this still only taps slightly into the creative depths that 2-player mode will be able to provide, as I will demonstrate now with a couple of different ideas. Normally, to me, a lot of the complaints I've seen made towards 2-player mode is that they are often too complicated to learn. While I could just go for the easy card and say skill issue, I would still say that, yeah, that is probably the biggest criticism I could make for Duel Maestro, for instance. It is terribly difficult to learn how to do everything due to the lack of interaction between parts even here. Hence, here's my first demonstration of what can be done with 2-player mode. A duel where you can press both dual inputs at the same time as if it was a traditional duel, which is a much easier version to learn. I know that this idea sounds redundant on its own, but not only are you doing more with the game's inputs, but you can add variation, like I've done for this duel in my unreleased level Shoemaker. I begin the 2-player mode duel with double inputs for the first few jumps, but then add some variation by only having one of them jump at a time and vice versa. It makes the duel very simple to understand, yet demands more interaction from the player input and using the 2-player mode gimmick. This is perfectly expandable too, with no limitation to how much you can utilize this variation. Sure, some players might think this is completely pointless, since you could just make it into a normal duel, but you're still doing more here with player input, regardless of what the outcome of your actions are. It's automatically more engagement, which I consider a plus for gameplay interaction. And that idea continues when moving on to the second gameplay approach I wanted to mention that 2-player mode provides, at least in a way more reasonable way. One thing that has often bugged me with modern gameplay in this game, especially on the more harder end, is how stupid spammy some levels are. Some of these levels demand so much quick pressing that you're bound to develop severe hand pain and repetitive strain injuries. I am aware that that is the risk of playing any game with this kind of gameplay, but the difference here is that that aspect is practically baked into the design here. I hate this kind of gameplay, and if I were to try and actually beat some of these things, my hand would be in pain afterwards, which is not a good end result at all. But that is where 2-player mode comes in, because now, kind of similar to how butterfly clicking works in a way, you can divide the number of clicks between two fingers, but with the spacebar and left mouse here, effectively cutting down the number of inputs needed for one finger by half. You can also create some really fun and well-synced gameplay ideas, just needing to alternate between the two fingers to a simple rhythm, almost as if you're playing a drum. And if you're one of those chronic Twitter users who just view the inability to click fast as a skill issue, have a look at how much the number of clicks per second increases with this 2-player mode method. Yeah, talk shit now. Not only is this a much better way to actually create fast-paced gameplay since it allows your fingers to not develop injuries as easily, but it also quite substantially increases the amount of inputs you can actually do per second. I also believe that this is a method that would favor the mobile playing community more as opposed to the PC one, and considering how many players are just openly cheating nowadays and trying to pass it off as something honorable and that they have the right to do it, I feel like they definitely need the upper hand on something at this rate. So maybe this will be it. And now, the main reason I wanted to make this video to begin with. We now have the third gameplay concept that 2-player mode introduces, and it is quite frankly so goddamn cool when done right. A 4-icon duel. I can totally imagine some people are staring at this, wondering how this is even remotely possible to control, but in reality, the concept here is in theory really basic, I assure you. To give you an idea of how this functions, imagine the duel from Hexagon Force. If you perform a jump here, both icons will jump at the same time, given the icons are both at the ground simultaneously, since they're tied to one input, which let's say in this instance is the left mouse. If this was in 2-player mode, this changes by having only one icon tied to left mouse, and for example spacebar tied to the other icon. So much like the shoemaker duel, you have to press both at the same time in order for the same action to be done. But what if you were to combine these two concepts into one? 2 icons to one input, but both the spacebar and left mouse available. As such, if you assign one real icon and one fake icon to each input, 2 plus 2, and you have 4. And the gameplay parts that I've shown you here are all designed with the same thought and idea as the shoemaker duel and the RSI counter. And the reality of this 4-icon duel idea is that it doesn't need to be all the same game mode. If you really wanted to, and you knew how to set it up, you could 100% create a duel of this kind with 4 entirely different game modes all at once. But don't get me wrong though, making gameplay in this manner is unironically really difficult, and it is by far the most challenging concept that I've introduced in this video. The potential for difficulty here is pure insanity, but the level of skill required to put this together seamlessly and have it all flow naturally takes a lot of craftsmanship. But I guarantee you that it is possible, as me personally, I'm getting into all kinds of crazy experiments in my recent levels that I'm personally building. Plus, if there's one element that is very easy to complain about Geometry Dash, is the lack of modern gameplay innovation. The decoration is the one thing this community has going for it, but gameplay has been deliberately ignored for years, which makes playing the game so much more boring because the gameplay style hasn't changed in so long, and there are no popular pushes for any variety either. I would hope that me bringing this up might change that a little bit, and I would want to see what can be done with these concepts I've mentioned here. They suit every kind of difficulty, whether it be something really easy or something insanely hard. It's all appropriate if you know what you're doing. Despite this too, 2-player mode still has so many more uses for gameplay that I haven't even mentioned yet, but I won't be talking about more now. This video here was mainly to introduce a taste of what this heavily underused concept can bring in terms of gameplay design. And look, if people are afraid that this will result in even buggier levels in gameplay with creators attempting to experiment with this, at least with this, you can fuck up something complicated and not look like a complete moron fucking up something pathetically basic. You're not going to create something perfect right out of the get-go. Don't be afraid to experiment with new ideas just because something can go wrong. That's the mindset of creators that never accomplishes anything, straight up. So, get out there and make some innovative gameplay that the game desperately needs at this rate. I wish you the best of luck.